Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Hopinder Collicott. I'm the Director of Innovations and Partnership here at the Atlantic Institute. And today, my job is very simple. It's literally to welcome you here to our first of our series on artificial intelligence. So we've got our community, our group here in the room, but also a big welcome to everybody who's joining us online as well. It's a pleasure for you to be here with us today. The aim of today's session is to very much bring in the issue of artificial intelligence and to talk about artificial intelligence and some of the challenges it poses to social justice. But we'll come back in January. We'll come back to look at artificial intelligence and the potential that it has for us as well. So today is the first of a series of these conversations. And we've got two incredible speakers who are joining us today as GoBe robots behind me. We've got our very own Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity, Nasser Eledroos, who's joining us. But we've also got the campaigner and author, Laura Bates, who I'm sure many of you have known about, heard from various different places that she's been speaking at, and also maybe even read her book, which came out recently. So the event today is very much a bit of an experiment for us, because there's some of us who are here in the room, others who are here as an online community, but then we've also got our speakers who are here as GoBe robots. So we are really going to be experimenting a little with being co-present. How can we bring our community together, those of you who are in person as well as others who are online, and experiment with how we make connections, how we connect across screens, spaces, and also through robots as well. So please do enjoy this experience, and hopefully we'll be learning from it and be able to continue to come together in various ways as well. But today's conversation will also potentially be one that touches on many different subjects, but maybe even heavy subjects. And I wanted to just caveat the conversation before we get started. So it's going to be a bit of an exploration of how we are going to be able to use AI, but also some of the challenges that it poses for us. So I'm going to ask Alice Wroe, who is our XR lead here at Atlantic Institute, to guide us through this conversation and support us as we take this journey on. So Alice, I'm going to pass over to you to introduce our two speakers and to see how this conversation goes. And thank you so much for Laura and to Nasser for joining us today.
Thank you, Pin. Thank you. Amazing. Brilliant. That's a bit like the Olympic torch that we've passed on. Thank you so much, Pin. And thank you all for being here today, both online and in person. It is an exciting moment for us, and I'm feeling the nerves of experimentation jangle definitely through my body, hopefully through the room as well. Artificial intelligence, we all know it's this kind of threat that is flung far into the future, but it is causing immense harm right now. And that absolutely needs to be discussed. And that's what we are going to do today with Laura Bates and with Nasser Eledroos. You'll notice, as Pin said, that they're joining us as robots. And I ask you in the audience, and maybe even more so online, to really lean in to that experimentation. It might feel a bit crunchy at times, but we are trying to push the boundaries of hybrid and what it means to be together when we're apart. And if it goes a little bit wrong, don't worry, we can hold that. We've got the confidence, we've got backup plans, and try and lean into that as part of the experience as well. I cannot tell you what it means to be joined by Laura Bates today. She is one of the most influential, leading UK feminists, absolutely. And in her book, which I have here, I was going to get her to sign it, and then I realised that's not going to work here. But she writes about deep fakes, which is something we will talk about in this session. And she wrote about the men who used her likeness to create porn. And there was a moment when I was reading it that I set the book down because I was sobbing these huge, rage-filled tears for Laura and for all of us. Because she wrote, what if this is my legacy? What if this digital version of myself doing the rounds on the porn sites that she has no control over is what lives on after she dies? And it hit me as so painfully untrue, Laura, because your legacy will be the hundreds of women that you've inspired to become activists, the thousands of schoolgirls that you speak to and move regularly, the laws that have been changed under your guidance. The perpetrators wanted to use this tech to squash Laura, but actually through your writing and your speaking, you are multiplied through all of us again and again. And it is my delight to bring Laura into conversation with Nasser, who is such a thoughtful, caring, astute Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity. He is a public interest technologist, and he so often leads our community in thought. He has this sharp, razor-sharp analysis paired with a really kind and gentle approach. And he works as a policy strategist for Colour of Change, where he designs and implements technology to develop technology policy to protect Black people's rights in the US. And I often feel so grateful to be in community with Nasser. So please join me in welcoming both these exceptional people to the lab today. Brilliant. So we've got about 50 minutes together today, and I'm going to ask some questions to both Nasser and Laura to kind of establish our path. And then I'm going to hand over to you all in the audience and online for questions, and we will kind of navigate this conversation together. But I'm going to jump right in, Laura. Your book has been described as an alarm bell to the harms that are happening right now to women and girls as a result of artificial intelligence. And I wondered if I could ask you, why are you sounding this alarm?
I think there is an incredibly urgent moment of opportunity now to act. Anybody, I think, who has done any research on the impact of social media on women and marginalized communities, but actually lived through the advent of social media, has seen a microcosmic example of what it means when a technology comes along that transforms so many different aspects of our lives, that becomes inextricably intertwined with our politics, our media, our communication, our social lives, and for so many of us, our careers and our work lives. We know exactly what happens when that technology is developed at breakneck pace, absolutely in the service of profit and growth above equity, above safety, and when the guardrails are not put in despite the voices that are so often raised, particularly the voices of women of colour, raised always the earliest, always the first and worst affected, always the most likely to be ignored. We know what happens when those voices are ignored and dismissed, and we reach a point where the technology becomes so overwhelmingly ingrained and embedded in our world and our lives, and so overwhelmingly profitable, that it becomes almost impossible. You reach a point where it apparently is almost impossible to create the necessary foundational and systemic changes that would be required for that technology to be used by women and marginalized groups without the incredibly high price of daily disinformation, doxing, death threats, rape threats, racism, misogyny, harassment, abuse, stalking. So if you think of that as a kind of microcosm, we are teetering on the precipice of seeing a similar kind of tidal wave of seismic change across our society, this time with the advent of AI and the impact AI will have on every aspect of our society: financial services, healthcare, criminal justice, education. And we have again this moment of opportunity to learn from the past 20 years and to say, this time, let's heed the voices of warning, let's build it right, because actually the risks are much greater this time around. We're talking about something exponentially larger. And if we don't act now to put in place reasonable guardrails, reasonable regulation, to initiate safety by design protocols, we are likely to find ourselves in a similar mess again, but on a really much greater scale. And it's going to be so much harder to unpick. We are building the foundations of a new world. And at the moment, we are building it literally on the embedded foundations of existing racism, sexism, ableism in our society. And it doesn't have to be that way.
I really feel that, Laura, in terms of this is our moment. And that really comes across in your book. It's like, it's not this inevitable future. There is a sense of agency. But I wonder if you could just make real what these threats are. When we talk about them quite conceptually, could you just kind of give us a chance to understand what is it in real terms that we would be kind of anxious about?
That's such an important question, actually, because so many of us have a really shadowy sense of the threat from AI being a dystopian potential future risk of cyborgs taking over the world. Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that we're not talking about a single type of threat. We're talking about a number of different ones. I would categorize them into perhaps three different broad categories. The first would be the use of AI tools explicitly designed to harass and abuse. So, deepfake, nudify tools, I think, are a very clear example of that. So, using AI to create new channels for old forms of misogyny, to amplify it, to make it more accessible than ever before to greater numbers of people. The second would be tools which are not explicitly designed with a deliberate outcome of bias, but which nonetheless have that outcome unintentionally. These are tools which are either because of the way in which they work or because of perhaps the fact that they've been designed by non-diverse teams, end up having unwanted consequences. Examples I would give of this would be AI tools being used in recruitment by around 70% of firms already, which we know actively discriminate against the CVs of women and marginalized groups. AI tools being used by global financial services firms, which again we know actively discriminate when it comes to downgrading credit scores, being less likely to allow loans, again to women and marginalized groups in the context, of course, of an existing $17 billion global gender credit gap. Healthcare algorithms, like one in place in the US already, where under a healthcare system treating 200 million patients a year, the AI tools being used to assess patients in need for extra care were proven to be downgrading the number of Black patients identified for extra care by more than half. So those are tools having catastrophic unintended consequences because they haven't been required to meet sufficient regulatory thresholds before being rolled out to use for the general public to prove that they are safe and ethical. And the third example I would give is tools which are having a biased output because they are ingesting and trained on vast amounts of existing flawed data. So this particularly would be generative AI tools, things like, of course, Llama, ChatGPT, large language models. And what we are seeing in studies by UNESCO and lots of other places of these tools is that because they ingest vast amounts of flawed data, including existing racism, sexism, other forms of bias and inequality, they don't just spew that racism and sexism back out at us. They actually act to intensify it because of the ways that they are designed to eliminate outliers, for example. They are likely not just to replicate and to embed that prejudice in the foundations of storytelling, of marketing, of our future worldview, but actually specifically to worsen and to intensify it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. As always, you are so comprehensive. This just, yeah, thank you. And I think that we'll pull out some of the case studies in your book as well. So if you're online or even in the room and you're kind of thinking, yeah, these concepts about AI, they get bandied around, we will breathe some kind of personal stories into this that will kind of lift them into understanding. I also wanted to say to both Nasser and Laura, should you want to move around a little bit as the robots to kind of see each other or to see who's in the room, please do feel free to do that. Yeah. And we'll all, yeah, twinkle with it, but do feel free to do that. Thank you, Nasser. You guys are pretty close to me now, I will say. So Nasser, I'm going to turn to you. You focus in your work on racial justice particularly. What is ringing alarm bells for you in artificial intelligence?
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this discussion. Yeah, a lot of what Laura mentioned just now really resonated with me. We have been building these public systems, right? We have had policing systems, welfare systems, benefit systems. They operate in such a way that they produce administrative data, simply just data that requires them to function. And for some reason, we and I mean the collectively, not literally we here in this room, are taking these systems and deciding that the right thing to do is to feed them into AI, right? To augment them into these smart systems with efficiency being the goal, and then pretending that an output out of that would be neutral. Black communities, brown communities, racialized communities. This isn't just limited to the United States where I work. It takes that and then perpetuates old racist patterns. Yeah. They now get a technical seal of approval, and it suddenly becomes much more harder to challenge them because it's the algorithm, quote unquote, deciding that. we see this really first and foremost in policing, in the ways that in the United States, Black communities, poor communities interact with the state. And that's not just limited to the way that a police interaction may happen on the street. It also ends up encountering and impacting things like fraud detection, excuse me, more in sort of the benefit systems, or risk or eligibility in an immigration context. This means that people are being used in an experimentation sense
Yeah.
with these systems that cannot be that are actually unproven
Yeah.
with respect to whether or not they should be used for food, housing, legal status, and in so doing, the deployment of them then is further ingesting more and more types of data from these people, simply by matter of these people just existing, and it's then supercharging the data sort of extraction pipeline, right? Like the data that goes into I always like to say that with this idea of quote unquote predictive policing is a bit of a ridiculous concept, because it's not predicting anything. It's just telling the police where to go, where they already are going. And it's just supercharging that, because we are operating off of data that's strictly from the police themselves. And finally, we were seeing, there was actually a great piece in Wired magazine just over the weekend about the data center fight. We're in the United States, we've had sort of a stagnation over about a generation or so with regards to our energy production. We haven't produced more and more energy, and suddenly the demand has just gone straight up, where AI companies are demanding more and more and more data, excuse me, more and more energy to facilitate and transact that data. And they are going to find that energy capacity in the communities with already the least power to resist. So those who have been disenfranchised in the vote, or who do not have representational power within an elected body, and that largely is people that is largely Black and brown people. Um, it's part of this broader cycle that's making AI just a very, very harmful state of affairs.
No, so we talk often in the lab and also together personally about this idea that the power structures and the harms of the past are being perpetuated into the future in the very, in the fabric of this technology. And so in the algorithm, we've got empire, we've got slavery, we've got contemporary racism all bound up there. And I wonder, when we talk about data, could you just explain what is that? What is the data that we're talking about that is feeding these large language models, which is what LLM stands for, that is making these sort of racist decisions?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to understand is that it's training data, and it is in effect an enormous compressed archive of human history. I mean, truly just an enormous amount of information. And it's largely scraped from the internet, or is otherwise other digitized text. Um, so with that, it then means it's an archive of our hierarchies, our racism, our sexism, our propaganda, and any blind spots we have.
Yeah.
It's marinating in that history and not explicitly correcting for it.
Such a good word.
And
it's marinating in that history. Let's grab that out. I'll scrape that from
yeah.
you now, sir. Yeah.
Well, on top of it, it's also then important to recognize that this is information that has been digitized, especially from historical records. So we're talking about largely English language, just given the English bias of the internet. And it's that which has been prioritized for collection. So whatever institutions performed that work then decided and deemed that they needed to have it as an archive. So it then got curated and stored.
Yeah.
Right? And so on top of that archive, we in the AI companies, add human labels, people all over the world that are asked to mark things as toxic, as safe, as truthful, as misleading, polite, rude. And all of that is without any cultural or political context for the communities from which either that information is from or from which the information is being used.
Yeah.
It's subtle interpretive work that basically historians, archivists, translators, local experts do, and that becomes completely invisible because then the data is then flattened
Yeah.
by people or not those people
Yeah.
into these labels.
Nasser, my friend, if you were in person, I'd put my hand on your shoulder and turn your body just slightly so that you can see this side of the room. Are you able to? Yes, you got it. Perfect. The camera wants your full face. Thank you, Nasser.
There we go. You got me.
And yeah, that is so so useful and true and a little bit scary. But thank you for sharing a little bit more about what data is and kind of what it does. So, Laura, I'm going to turn back to you. One of the best and brilliant things about this book is the way that you get people, particularly women, to speak to you. I've had that firsthand. You just want to share with Laura when you're with her. And there was a particular story that you talked around, well, there's many stories about deep fakes. And I wonder if you could share with the audience, firstly, what is a deep fake? Because lots of people here won't know what it is. And then also, what are deep fakes doing to women and girls? What is the cost of this to women and girls and justice, really?
Sure.
Thank you.
So when we talk about deepfakes, we're talking about the capacity to take a still image of a person that you have screenshotted perhaps from social media, from the internet, and to feed it into an AI tool that will then generate image or video, making it appear that that person has done or said things that they didn't really do or say. So you can think of it as a kind of evolution of crude forms of abuse, for example, where celebrities' faces were photoshopped onto porn videos in days gone by, resulting in forms of abuse that were crude and still impactful, but could be easily identifiable as fake. What we're seeing now is that the technology has continued so quickly and has accelerated at such pace that you no longer need, as you used to be able to feed in huge amounts of footage, many different angles and images of a person to be able to then generate a video of them seeming to do something. You can now actually use a single image and get some fairly realistic stuff out of it. When we talk about that, because obviously that's something that's quite a seismic development for humanity, there is frequently a real focus on what are the implications of this for democracy. And very much the implication within that conversation, the unsaid implication is that we're talking about white men. We're talking about white male politicians and how can they know that the electorate will be able to trust what they've said? Will there be an erosion of trust?
Yeah.
And that is, of course, a really important conversation and question to consider. Of course it is. But what is so often left out of the headlines and the focus, for example, you would be absolutely forgiven for thinking from a recent Europol report that was released on how we police and tackle deepfakes, that was the main issue, because in a 22-page report, the word women was mentioned only once, and there were 2 short paragraphs on sexually abusive, pornographic deepfake images. The reality is that 96% of all deepfakes generated are pornographic in nature, and that 99% of those victimize women. So the reality is that this is overwhelmingly a feminist issue, a misogynistic issue. And the irony is that there is a significant political angle here, because women in politics, women in the public eye, women in journalism, activists are much more likely to be targeted. For example, 1 in 6 currently serving US congresswomen have fallen victim to this form of abuse. Here in the UK, over 30 high-profile UK female politicians were targeted on a website that hosted 400 images and videos of them. Those were viewed 12 million times before the website was taken down. So there's your threat to democracy. It does exist, but it isn't the kind of vague future one that we're talking about. It's happening now. And ordinary women and girls are being impacted in desperate ways. There are smaller local websites, for example, where these images are made to order openly, where they're posted and shared with local women's names, their workplaces, their addresses. It's affecting schoolgirls at the age of 10 or 11 who are dropping out of education, who are developing PTSD, who are often being forced back into classrooms with perpetrators amid an education system that has no idea how to grapple with this, and where teachers and schools are often so far behind the curve that they have no idea this technology even exists. So the impact is massive, and also the scale is really significant. We're on track to see 8 million of these images produced by the end of this year alone, that around 8 million annually. And we know that the links from social media platforms, referral links to sites that host these images and videos, have increased 2,000% over the last year alone. So this is an exploding form of technology. There is huge widespread adoption. There is easy accessibility, including to children, but the recognition of the problem and who it's affecting and how isn't necessarily in place.
And you talk, Laura, about a particular case study that I might ask you to share about a group of young women in Spain. And the bit that I'm most interested in is that you talk about the law comes later, the policy changes, but what matters for the young people in that moment is the response of community leaders, because that sets the tone.
Yes.
And we've got a lot of community leaders in our audience. And I wonder if you could advise us, after an attack like this that uses AI, that's confusing, that nobody quite knows what's going on, how should we respond and support victims when this happens within our communities?
So, I mean, a clarity of response is absolutely vital. One of the things that has been really clear when these kinds of attacks occur is that there is often a perception of a lack of real harm. You know, this is online and the images aren't even real. So how does it affect that person in any way? What we know from the cases we've seen is that in a racist and misogynistic society that stigmatizes and slut shames and blames victims, the impact is just as real as if those images were real. What we're seeing is that, particularly where children are involved, there's a real lack of understanding of that. But in the case in Spain that Alice just referred to, which was a couple of years ago now, and this is moving very quickly, that tends to be the case that's most often referenced, even though the reality is that we're seeing a huge number of cases cropping up here in the UK as well. But people don't really want to kind of accept that or broach that.
Yeah.
But what happened was that the mother of one of the girls affected was a woman who had quite a big voice in the local community. She had a very big social media following. She was a doctor. And she really stood up to challenge the idea that the girls had anything to be ashamed of. And she challenged the idea that this was meaningless and that it was banter and that it was all just a joke and that the boys didn't really know what they were doing. And she spoke out about the implications of what had happened and about the shame and the severity of this that really should be attached with the perpetrators, and the fact that the girls had nothing to be ashamed of. And it had a really significant impact in the local community and on the girls' own experiences. She really shifted the perception of the issue, people's conversations, and the kind of local attitudes towards what had happened, which of course is a really powerful and a really positive thing. And we absolutely need that societal shift. But what I would also argue is that we have to look at regulation.
Yeah.
We have to look at how and why these tools are available. We need to look at the websites and the app stores that are hosting them, that are making them easily accessible to children. We need to look at the payment providers that are enabling them to take payment. And we need to look at the ways in which they are impacting on women in the public eye, and then therefore potentially also impacting everything from education to democracy as well.
Thank you. And so I think I'll ask one question on that around policy to both of you, and then we will shift into some questions from both our rooms. So if you are thinking of a question online, please put it into the Q&A, and Sangeetha, our wonderful host online, is going to send them me on WhatsApp. And in the room, have a little think if you have any questions. The policy one is a huge question, because the main answer is that just like with social media, this technology is moving too fast. The policy, the legislation is always outdated. How can we possibly keep up? And fundamentally, that is just not good enough at all. So I'll start with you, Nasser. What approach do we take, and presumably it's multi-pronged, to building legislation, to building policy that is big enough and encompassing enough to speak to these issues?
Yeah. I think so. First of all, there's all the varying modalities in which AI is seeping into the different aspects of our society, right? Like Laura's work touches, and you mentioned just now in the discussion around deep fakes. Neither of us have really spoken at length about sort of building the AI we're seeing being built really on top of that, which is AI generated video editors and producers, right? From the big companies, Google, OpenAI. Recently, we've seen, with the U.S. government being shut down, this false narrative being pushed where Black women are there's these AI videos being created of Black women, and like in a very caricature and a very problematic way, saying that these groups of people are demanding access to what in the United States we have the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is called SNAP, and that the program needs to be shut down, and it's really just creating images of these people in this really like very unkind, very inhumane light, and it's being done. There's no restrictions on it. There's no policy saying that it cannot be done, right? And similarly, in the other vein, people who have a copyrighted likeness get all the restrictions in the world. You can go directly to the OpenAI and say, actually, yeah, I don't want someone like this coming out as part of the outputs. So, as a matter of policy, I think we have to be able to comfortably say what data is going into this and what data cannot come out of it. Like fundamentally, there must be a disclosure on the part of the companies with respect to the sources of the data, and it beyond just someone's copyrightable likeness. We have to really be able to, as a society, like draw very hard lines that and empower then the administrative regulatory bodies, in the United States, that would be the Federal Trade Commission, to go seek penalties from companies that otherwise do design tools to that violate these rules.
I think that's really smart, because so often we focus on, is it the responsibility of the tech company or is it the responsibility of the government? And your answer just straddles both, Laura, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely couldn't agree more. We have to take a multi-pronged approach. We have to look at data input, data output. I mean, interestingly, deepfakes are one of the areas where some effort has been made towards thinking about legislation. There are other areas, in some cases, with even bigger implications and applications where I don't think we've even reached that point. What we've seen is there are a number of ways to approach it. So you've got countries like Denmark, which are proposing legislation that would grant its citizens copyright over their own faces. That's one potential approach. There is, in the Online Safety Act here in the UK, we've seen attempts to tackle issues around deepfakes, so making it illegal to create them, but only with clear intent to distribute widely and cause distress. So there's always loopholes, and then we have seen attempts to begin to close those loopholes, not to the degree I would like around possession of the images. I think we should bring that into line with child sexual abuse legislation. And we also can see actually some really useful evidence of how non-intersectional legislation leaves behind certain communities in the way this has been introduced. So, for example, the definition of intimacy in the Act is a very white Western definition that would leave women who, for example, might be really vulnerable to harm if they should experience a deep fake that was made showing them not wearing a headscarf if they usually wear one, for example, not protected, not having the same redress. So we need to think about what the legislation looks like, of course, as well as we craft it and think about those intersections. But you're right, it has to be legislation where the responsibility is firmly on tech companies who are making obscene accumulation of wealth off the back of these technologies, while simultaneously telling us that it's impossible to police, that it's too difficult, that regulation strangles innovation. And we've seen these arguments made before, and we know that it isn't true. We know it isn't true because they have such enormous reserves of wealth and power. And also in terms of their engineers, in terms of the people working for them, they have the greatest minds in the world. If they wanted to innovate safety and with a safety by design approach, they could, but they won't do it unless we force them to. We know that from social media. We know that if we let them mark their own homework, they won't. But we also know that actually, if the uptake of AI more broadly in society is the aim and is going to be profitable for the sector, we know that regulation actually enhances trust. It makes it more likely for that uptake to happen because it gives market confidence and so on. So there's every reason really to dismiss these claims that, unlike any other sector in the world, this one sector should
Yeah.
simply be exempt from accountability.
Yeah.
But the tech lobby has done such a powerful job of convincing people of that over the last 10 years. So where if it were an automobile or a child's toy or a new type of food, we would absolutely expect and accept with no raised eyebrows that before rolling it out to the public, it has to meet certain safety criteria and guidelines.
Yeah.
Somehow, when it comes to tech, we all just accept the fact that that's completely impossible and it
Yeah.
can't be done, which clearly is nonsense. And so that's where, yeah, we need to lean on governments, because we need governments to stand up and be brave about saying, actually, no, you don't get a free pass. You don't get to completely avoid all kinds of accountability.
Yeah. Yeah. In your book, there's a great moment when you talk about, food companies and saying, a small group of people might get salmonella, but it's actually fine because we're learning some stuff. It's like, we so wouldn't do that with another industry. Yeah. Thank you. Brilliant. So I'm going to turn now to questions in the room. We've got such a special audience with us. I could see you, Nathan, who you're from the Oxford Internet Institute. You were nodding away. I was like, I'm so glad you're here. So if we've got any questions in the room, and for those online, I'm going to open my phone and see if any questions are coming in. But if anybody has questions in the room for Nasser, for Laura, for each other, then please do. Put your hands up. Great. Owen, we'll start with you. And I've got a mic coming to you, so don't you start talking too soon. Is this one an okay mic? I had to, yeah? Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Owen.
Thanks so much. Hi, Owen Pringle from the Atlantic Institute. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you so much for your insights. Obviously over the weekend we've seen the first AI-produced single reach the top of the Billboard charts. I think it was the country Billboard charts. So we're seeing widespread public acceptance of AI and what people are prepared to accept in that space move faster than legislation can. So on a behavioral level, if the law can't move, or the instruments of law can't move fast enough, what would the panel suggest are the ways in which we can close that gap on the way in which society views what's acceptable in terms of AI and what the law accepts?
Nasser, you've got a thoughtful face on. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, it's really, I appreciate this question because, these models that create music are often trained on, they are trained on a lot of caricature or even just like the averaging of popular music. And it's a fully, if there was ever such an example of just like a fully extractive industry that's happening right here, it is music AI models being used to then create more music. And it's especially with race, it's not just a copyright issue. It's another moment in a long pattern where black culture, other racially minority culture is like celebrated as content, while the people actually just end up remaining precarious and disposable. So to the solution, I think there is actually a lot of work yet to be done in the world of copyright law to hold these companies to account. I can't speak to music, but I do know with like the image creation models, people have been red teaming them to basically reproduce actual one-to-one the source photographs or the source pieces of art, and then using that as evidence to say like, look, like my material is in this source data, I can recreate it in the model exactly. This is absurd. But I don't think that I think copyright law and copyright accountability still needs to be updated, because you do have to demonstrate that a harm has taken place. And often, of course, when the data sets are private, it's like really, really, really difficult to do that. So I don't have a strong answer to you other than that, like, we just need the copyright policy, the copyright regulation, certainly in the United States at least, to change. And I will say that by and large, although unfortunately the tide seems to be turning, the music industry is on the side of the creators, because without humans because a lot of the money, a lot of the income streams are from in-person performances, right? Like when artists go on tour. So, I think that reminding people of the human in the loop is like a very much a conscious effort on the parts of consumers and on the parts of artists. So I am hopeful that we'll get there with music, but I think there's a long road ahead of us.
Thank you, Nasser. Another great soundbite, reminding people of the human in the loop. I think that's what we need to do. Laura, what's your thoughts on this?
I agree. I mean, I think that this is actually a problem that we are really fighting across multiple fronts in the creative industries. We've seen a huge response from authors as well about the ways in which their work has been taken and used without any consent or payment to train models, and also around the creation of written works as well by AI models. I mean, I think it's a complicated answer. You're right. The legislation is going to take a long time to catch up. In the UK, really powerful, positive work on this is being done in the House of Lords by Baroness Beban Kidron. So she's a great person to follow if you're interested in that side of it. But you're right, it's how do we create that cultural pushback? How do we harness people power in saying, actually, we don't want to accept this. We don't want to consume this. We want to, as consumers, be mindful and be really have an activist, perhaps, impact in the choices that we are making. For me, a big part of that comes down to letting people know. If you look at the November 2003 issue of the Harvard Crimson, when a nascent website called FaceMash had just been launched that illegally scraped data and allowed students to rate hot or not their fellow students, of course, founded by then student Mark Zuckerberg. It was the Harvard Black Women's Association and the Fuerza Latina associations that raised objections. Again, the women of color at the beginning saying there is capacity here for harassment, for abuse, for misinformation. And what they said, which I just find so powerful now when I look back at that article, what one of those associations representatives said was, I just think people should know.
Yeah.
And you had this impression of something that was happening that she could see if it was left unchecked, if people didn't know this was happening and didn't have the opportunity collectively to object, to weigh in about what we want to accept as a society, as a culture, that was going to have this potentially devastating impact. And of course, you can look back on those words now and see how right she was. And I kind of feel like there is a second moment of that now here. People don't know, people aren't aware. People will download and listen to that song and laugh about it and see it as a kind of harmless bit of fun and a kind of eccentricity, and they won't necessarily be aware of or be thinking about the implications and the wider harms. And I think that goes for so many of the different areas that we've discussed. So many people think, well, as long as I'm not choosing to enter the metaverse or using deepfake tools myself, I'm protected from this. It's an online problem. And I actually think more broadly as well, if people understood, if people knew this will affect you if you apply for a job tomorrow, if you apply for a loan tomorrow, then I think we would be giving people a collective opportunity to object. And I know that sounds a bit overly idealistic. And what does that look like in practice for us as individuals? But what I would say is there are brilliant organizations who are fighting back on our behalf, who we can lend our might to, our voices, our donations, our raising of awareness, our signing of petitions. The Algorithmic Justice League is a really good example of this. And it's a great way of individuals collectively standing together to object against practices from AI tools and firms before the legislation has yet caught up.
Thank you, Laura. I've got one from online and then I'll come to another in the room. Someone online has said that they're a teacher and they're teaching about cyberbullying and digital wellness with their students. She asks, what else would you recommend we can do in our schools to raise awareness about this topic? And I'd like to add, if I can, Laura, since we last met, we've both become parents. And if I could just add an extra level of what can we do as parents to support our children, because that's what makes me feel completely shredded by this topic.
Yeah.
So we'll go Laura and then Nasser. Thank you.
I think people are terrified because they think there has to be one perfect silver bullet solution. If you don't do it, then everything's a disaster. And I think it's much more nuanced than that, both for schools and for individual parents. It's not just about digital literacy and source skepticism, which are really important. it's also about teaching about systemic misogyny and racism, about healthy relationships, about respect, about boundaries. And all of that comes from a much younger age than the point at which they are directly engaging with these technologies. So, my advice for schools would be start much younger than you think you need to. Put in place the foundations of understanding about sexual consent, about healthy relationships, about bias, about prejudice, that will help them when they come into contact with various forms of harmful tech, rather than thinking that you need to be an expert in every individual form of tech and arm them against that specifically, because that's unrealistic. Children are always early adopters of new technologies, you'll always be behind the curve.
Yeah.
But building up that muscle of communication as parents, where we talk about these issues and we don't shy away from them and we point them out from a really young age.
Yeah.
When we're walking down the supermarket aisle and we say, that's weird, it says these are the men's magazines and those are the women's magazines, but I can see the National Geographic and the Economist and the New Statesman
Yeah.
under men's. What does that tell us? Instead of just walking past the sign and our child absorbing, okay, politics and economics, those things are for men, we're giving them the opportunity to learn that we don't have to accept the stereotypes that we are presented with, that we have the right to disrupt and to challenge and to question them, and that will stand them in such good stead later on, I think.
Thank you, Laura. That's brilliant. And Nasser, I've just thought about time. How would you mind if I went to another question in the room that would go to you rather than duplicating on the, on this question?
Please.
Wonderful. Okay, questions in the room. Okay, brilliant. We'll go one and then two. Yes. Oh, thanks, Richard. That would be really great. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. My question might be partly for you, Alice. So just to let you know, so I work for an organisation that tries to drive accountability among the biggest platforms to, I guess, force them really to take better measures to prevent online misogyny and the harms arising from it. And a big part of that is stakeholder engagement. And I'm really curious how you see mechanisms and technology like that we're using today to help connect politicians, platforms with the people that are essentially the victims of harms like these around the world.
Thank you so much, Tracy. A fantastic question. Nasser, I'll go first to you to see what you think on that.
Yeah, well, so much of our world operates, this digital world operates frictionlessly, right? That we sort of just jump online and then it's like a never-ending sea of content, a never-ending sea of digital experiences. And they are inherently isolating. The politicians don't interact with the public vice versa, do not get that opportunity as well. So I think that it's specifically for advocates, it's really incumbent on trying to facilitate as much cross-pollination as possible. And there's everything from direct action to public messaging to showing up where people are. I mean, I think in the United States, there's something really going on right now in the politic where politicians are simply just outside. They're in people's faces, and or even candidates for office, and that is driving this like it's feeding into the attention economy. It's feeding into the algorithms, but it comes from this place of confrontation, of interrogation of these ideas. I'll let Laura speak more specifically to the topics of around misogyny and around of that type of violence. But I do want to just say that like we're in a really interesting political environment where people are not always, it's fun of people to have conversations with them in the recognition that that will then become social media sound bites that will then get, propagated out into the world. And that is what is driving people's ideas, their thoughts, and their attention online. I think if people are smart about trying to change the status quo, you're really optimizing for that and speaking to the people whose feeds are likely to want that kind of information. And you can then use that sort of as a lobbying force in order to push the change you're looking for.
I think just to add, Tracy, and I'm probably going to be stealing the words out of Laura's mouth because it's from her book, but I was so struck in Laura's book how she said that so often it's the young female teacher that is tasked with that has been a victim of this sort of abuse, that is then tasked with leading the assembly and doing the investigation. And actually, Laura says if the male PE teacher could be the one to do it, how powerful that would be in terms of like the movement not having to be led by those people that are most affected by it. So I think that's kind of my gut reaction to your answer, is like thinking about how you engage with the victim through who can support them in their community that's not necessarily who you'd first think of, you know.
Yeah, and I think just
Oh, let me pass you this.
the regulators that are creating the laws and the norms that are driving this at the moment are by and large in the US and
Yeah.
Europe, right? But the harms for people, as Laura's pointed out, and I completely agreed with everything you'd said, are very different depending where you are.
Absolutely.
A deep fake in one part of the world could be a direct risk to your life.
Yeah.
And actually, for any of us for whom that happened to, traveling the world might pose more risks to us than we realise in the future as well. Yeah. So I think there's a question of accountability, not just for, you know, the rules you're creating and how they affect your voters or the people that you want to vote for you, but also the much larger effects that those rules have, maybe unintended, you know, unintentionally on much wider communities around the world. And I think the potential for that connection and accountability is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Laura, would you mind if I went to one more question? Oh, brilliant. You had a question here at the front.
Thank you so much, guys. Fantastic. And really enjoyed that. It was, as Alice could see, I was nodding along, and it was making me think about the William Gibson quote about the future already being here, but not evenly being distributed. And I guess my question was really on the kind of theory of change. So Laura, you mentioned kind of raising awareness and organizing, and we've also spoken about kind of lobbying policymakers and kind of having a countervailing pressure to the kind of big tech lobby. And I guess on asking this question, I'd be curious for you guys to reflect on, if I understand it, you're people working on two sides of the Atlantic in different political contexts, and on two, like, while it's an intersectional issue, you're coming at it from different perspectives. So I guess I was curious to think about how you find or think about allying with unconventional kind of people in this fight. So like in the US context, we saw that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ed Markey voted together on a kind of piece of AI legislation. You couldn't imagine two people kind of further away. And I imagine from hearing some of your kind of perspectives, you're coming from what could be called a kind of AI skeptic kind of community. There's also the kind of EA rationalist, safetyist folks who I imagine many of us would disagree with in some ways. But I guess the question is, when you're trying to kind of, as well as raising awareness, you're trying to lobby kind of people, how do you think about finding allies who might not fit in your kind of corner of the world, seeing it on other issues? Thank you.
Beautiful question. Thank you. And if you could both answer this, but I'm thinking like 1.5 minutes each, that'd be amazing. Laura, let's go to you.
I think that's a really interesting question, because there's enormous potential and also enormous risk in those alliances. To a degree, they are necessary when we're talking about something this enormous, and particularly, I think, when the political reticence to act is so great. The picture in the US is so bleak, and so much of Europe is so closely following the US. You know, when you've got a president who is literally releasing declarations, presidential declarations against woke in AI, saying actually, you know, it's not okay for big tech companies to implement any of the kind of guardrails and safety that we are looking for. Yeah, you need a broad church to fight that, because we're talking about immense power and the kind of combination of almost the formation of a new kind of oligarchy from the combination of the political and the tech interests that are colluding and combining in the US is going to require an incredibly sturdy response. So it will be necessary to align. And I think there are so many areas of potentially really positive alignment between those who, as you said, are specifically focusing on different forms of bias and prejudice, where obviously we have so much to come together on, but also around different forms of harm. So, for example, there is an opportunity here, I think, to work very closely with those who have spent decades researching and resisting child sexual abuse, and specifically the digitization of that form of abuse. But that's also a good example of where the risks arise, because historically, when you see feminist and child sexual abuse organizations working together, what often you end up coming out with is legislation or regulation that focuses on age verification. And the risk there is that adult women are seen as collateral damage or as reasonable victims. So yeah, it's going to be really important to build those coalitions, but it's also going to be important when it comes to the point of hopefully having some victories and actually drafting the legislation, to think about those intersections, to think, as we've mentioned, about different groups, about different global contexts, and about making sure that it does end up being legislation that works for everybody.
Thank you, Laura. And Nasser, what's your take on that in 1.5 minutes?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. These tools are sold to us in ways to remove friction. I mentioned that earlier, but it's like type a prompt, skip the effort. The friction doesn't really disappear, though. It goes and shows up somewhere else, be it in overworked data labelers in the global majority, or content majority moderators, as warehouse workers and delivery drivers who are sprinting to sustain an instant delivery regime, and as future knowledge gaps for students, going back to the early conversations. I think you can frame then like this idea of friction as like a class experience, where some people get a seamless interface and some people absorb that strain. And I think then that speaks to the solutions, especially, Ed Markey and Marjorie Taylor Greene. That is a fascinating example, of course, but it's a pluralist example, right? It's this idea that coalitions and multiply marginalized or affected people as a consequence of AI can actually, and in fact must, work together. And my final point I think I'll say is that the tools exist to isolate us, right? They want to be the intermediary from which we interface with each other, and we really have to divorce ourselves from that. It is a problem that in New York City we see friend AI advertisements all over the city, as if that and a little tiny AI driven companion is actually the solution to our woes and our problems. People are the solutions, and these companies really don't want us interfacing with each other without them. That's a big issue.
I love that, Nasser. People are the solutions. As you can see, I've completely lost my voice in the final moments. 1 second, everyone. I'm very human here today. So, oh my gosh, the two of you are just the best. I'm going to finish by going to a question from the chat online. Renata says that she understands this conversation aims to raise awareness of the threat, but do we have examples of organisations working to reimagine the digital reality? And she says that she finds sometimes these conversations can be quite reactive, and it'd be great to hear about more positive visions of hope. And Renata, I can tell you, you're in the right place, because this session focused on threat. And then in February, we're hearing from Kay Firth Butterfield, who's the former inaugural head of the AI World Economic Forum. And the entire session is going to be leaning in to the beauty, the intricacies, the elegance of artificial intelligence and what it might enable us to do in the future. It's lucky this happened now, isn't it? My goodness. So Renata, it's happening, and I hope all of you will join us in the early new year for that event. Nasser and Laura, you are just such thoughtful, kind, clever people, and it has just been such a privilege to bring your ideas, your fears, your vulnerabilities into this space. Because as a community of hope and a community of action, it's important that we lean into these things, that we grapple with them, that we are afraid of them together, and then we can make some sort of sense, as you say, Laura, to kind of shift this technology to be used for good in all this multi-pronged, faceted, big approach that we can take together holding hands. So thank you to those online that logged in, to those in person, and to our wonderful speakers. Thank you. Maybe right before you log off, Laura and Nasser, you could move forward and take a bit of a pretend bow, and then we will all log out. Come on, Laura,